In this building at Cane Hill Road, some 40 men and women enrolled for the first full-time course in teacher training. This enrollment took place on the 11th of September 1950 at the Teachers Training College, which had been set up a few months earlier. Up to then, the TTC offered only part-time training. The founding of the TTC and the introduction of full-time courses marked a milestone in the evolution of education in Singapore. Two from this pioneer group of full-time teacher trainees went back to recount what it was like.
The course was very interesting. I think we were more or less like guinea pigs because we were the first batch.
And those were exciting times because at that time things were beginning to move in Singapore. We were moving towards independence. Political parties were beginning to get into prominence, and we were part of that. It was very exciting at that time.
In the mid-19th century, when Singapore was under British colonial rule, there was no overall education plan. Children, if they were formally educated, studied in their own vernacular. The various religious and ethnic communities set up their own schools. Teachers for vernacular schools came from their respective countries of origin. There was, however, an increasing demand for English education, and teachers catering to this need either came from abroad or were graduates of Raffles College, which was set up in 1928. In 1942, the Japanese captured Singapore. During the occupation, those schools which still functioned had to teach Japanese language and ideology. After 3 years, the Japanese surrendered and the war ended. There was much rebuilding to be done. This included coping with the post-war baby boom. The burgeoning population and the education setback caused by the war created an urgent need to re-establish and expand education facilities. In 1946, the Singapore Advisory Council's 10-year education plan proposed to build schools in various parts of the island and establish a teacher training college. Initially, due to the acute shortage of teachers, the TTC trained English medium school teachers under an emergency scheme. It was 6 months later that the first ever full-time course was introduced.
I was part of the emergency training scheme. The part-time scheme meant primarily that one taught in a school and came back in the afternoons for lectures about 3 times a week. Whereas the full-time course, which started in September of 1950, meant that we remained in college for most of the time and only went out for teaching in blocks of 4 weeks.
With the full-time course, the trainees could concentrate on the comprehensive training program provided.
I suppose in content would measure up to what is being done today. But in other matters, you know, the technological aids, OHPs, tape recorders and things like that were not available then. We had to rely mainly on our own voices and hands.
But they gave us quite a comprehensive course. We had English literature, theory and practice of education, and we had music, PE. I remember many things that we learned during that time.
You forget the once a week excursions we used to have. We had plays, projects to do, and we worked together all the time, and we helped each other. It was a wonderful class. We had ages ranging from 19 to 29, I think, and whereas some of us were quite young, others were very mature, and we were very cohesive because it was a small group.
Over the next 5 years, the number of trainees at the TTC more than trebled. The TTC also began to train teachers from other language streams. As the trainee intake increased, the TTC moved at the end of 1955 to its new premises at Patterson Road. At Patterson, the TTC progressively expanded its enrollment and diversified its programs. To alleviate the great shortage of teachers, the TTC scrapped its full-time course and introduced a new system of in-service training in 1960. This allowed student teachers to teach in schools and concurrently be trained at the TTC. Such a scheme was not ideal, but necessary at the time. Between 1963 and 1967, schools were built at an unprecedented rate of about 17 a year. The newly independent government placed education high on the agenda. It spent 1/3 of the national budget on education to meet the urgent educational needs of the nation. It was then up to the TTC to recruit enough teachers to cope with this dramatic expansion. The principal of the TTC during that time explains.
This was the time also when free primary education was introduced, and on the second day of January of any one year, there would be so many thousands of little kiddies, eager beavers waiting, raring to go, and there had to be so many hundreds of teacher bodies standing in front of them. This was really quite not merely an urgent situation, but I would say even a desperate situation, because we just didn't have the number of teachers to cope with these large numbers.
And the numbers were daunting. In 1967, more than a quarter of Singapore's total population were enrolled in primary and secondary schools. As Singapore's economy grew and diversified, people had to be trained to meet the country's manpower requirements. The TTC administration had to respond to these changes.
No longer were we just training a whole lot of children just to become clerks in offices and nothing else. We had to train young people to man the offices and to go into business houses and to go into areas where technical knowledge at higher than just artisan level was necessary. And this was really the reason why we had to go intensively into technical teacher training and diversify our program.
In 1970, Parliament passed the Institute of Education Act, which set new aims for developing and diversifying teacher training. The Act envisioned teacher education to be more closely related to education research. Thus, when the Institute of Education was formed as an autonomous body, it comprised 3 components: the Teachers Training College, the School of Education of the University of Singapore, and the Research Unit of the Ministry of Education. The union of these components set new standards for teacher education.
So as a result, IE had this twin objectives or foresight, if you like. One is teacher training and the other is research in education. And what we have been trying to do is to relate teacher training and research more closely. So in so doing, the training now is somewhat different in the sense that we are trying to get teachers to be somewhat more research-oriented, to be more investigatory in the approach to teaching.
This is called micro-teaching.
At present, some 1,400 students are enrolled at the Institute. Trainees are carefully selected and receive full-time training. The Institute also has professional courses for teachers in service. Having overcome the shortage of teachers, the current emphasis on teacher training is a relentless drive for higher standards in education. And at the heart of this vision of excellence in education are soundly trained, well-motivated teachers.
12 September 1945, the day the Japanese occupation of Singapore ended. In the municipal building, the Japanese delegation, led by Shiseido Itagaki, formally surrendered to Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. While the local population cheered the return of the British, the horror of the first bombing still rang in their ears. The Japanese first attacked Singapore at 4 a.m. on the 8th of December 1941. Their main targets were the airfields, but Raffles Place was also bombed, catching many civilians unaware.
I remember going to work, driving to St. Andrew's School, and many of the telegraph poles had fallen, and I saw bodies lying on the ground, bombed victims, you know, writhing in pain.
That particular morning, I was going to sit for my Cambridge exam, and the subject was Empire of the British, history of the British Empire. So we all students joked among ourselves and thought, my goodness, the British Empire is going to be shattered.
2 days later, the Japanese sank 2 British ships off Kuantan. With no air cover, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were easy targets. The myth of British invincibility went down with the ships. The Japanese attacked Singapore from the north, where her defense was weakest. They relied on strategy and speed. On the evening of the 8th of February 1942, 3 Japanese divisions crossed the Straits of Johor and established a foothold on the northwestern shore. By the 9th of February, Tengah airfield was in Japanese hands. 3 days later, the battle for Bukit Timah and the vital reservoirs was lost. On the 13th of February, despite gallant resistance by a Malay regiment, the Japanese broke through their defense at Pasir Panjang, and the whole city was within their reach. Singapore was on fire. Since January, air raids had increased in intensity, killing many civilians. With pipes damaged, most areas of town had no water. Civilians watched in bewilderment as Singapore fell. Without air raid shelters, many died from the constant bombing and shelling. All was confusion and despair. The casualties found no room in the hospitals.
Our hospitals were full. The wounded were just stretched out in the corridors, some of them with ghastly wounds. Mouth split right open, right to the throat. The mortuary was piled up right to the ceiling. It's impossible to describe the fearful number of casualties, and both civilian and military.
On Sunday, the 15th of February, a British delegation met the Japanese at the Ford factory in Bukit Timah to arrange a ceasefire. After an hour of confused argument, Yamashita compelled Percival to accept unconditional surrender. The British had been defeated, even though their troops outnumbered the Japanese. Singapore fell on the first day of the Chinese New Year. The island was renamed Sionan, or Light of the South. The Japanese occupation of Singapore had begun. Just 3 days after the surrender, the Japanese conducted a screening operation known as Sukching, which means to purge or eliminate. Chinese men between the ages of 18 and 50 were told to report to registration camps. The Chinese were singled out as some had supported China in its war effort against Japan. Those who passed the screenings had square marks stamped on them. Elizabeth Choi was among the families herded into a concentration camp at Arab Street.
We were there for several days. And at last, the Kempitai officer said, all right, all women and young children can go home. So we had to pass through a gate, and as we passed, each hand was given a chop. When my father, who was about 50-odd, when he passed through the gate and my brother was following, my brother was stopped. He was not allowed to pass, and he was in tears. He said, Daddy, are you going to leave me behind? There's no way. He was not allowed to go. And my father came home, and my brother was never seen or heard of after that. Don't know what happened to him.
Those identified as anti-Japanese were massacred en masse in remote areas like Changi and Punggol. Till today, it's not known how many Chinese died in the massacre. The Japanese official figure was 5,000, but the local estimate was 25,000 to 50,000. Elizabeth Choi and her husband, married just before the war, operated a canteen at a hospital at Tan Tock Seng. As sick British internees were allowed to be treated at the hospital, the couple helped to pass food, medicine and money to British prisoners in Changi. This landed them into trouble with the Kempitai, the Japanese military police. Elizabeth and her husband were brought to the Kempitai headquarters.
Every day a few people from the cell would be taken out for interrogation, for torturing, and their cries of agony, it's painful to hear. And very often, I myself was taken out, and they applied electricity on me, try to get me to admit. And my husband was brought to kneel beside me and said, now both of you must admit that you gave information to the military. Both of us said, no, we did not. So after much investigation, nearly a year, so one day I was called for interrogation. And the officer said to me, yes, we will release you because we have been asking everybody, and now we believe that what you had done was out of humanitarian purpose. So we will let you go.
The Japanese saw education as the most profound means of propaganda. They introduced a Japanese-style curriculum in primary schools. English was replaced by Nippon-go, or the Japanese language. Students were taught to sing patriotic Japanese songs, and Japanese lessons were given on the radio. Local teachers were required to learn Japanese. Some Singaporeans enrolled themselves in the classes, hoping that the Japanese would be better disposed towards them. During the Japanese occupation, basic foodstuff, especially rice, became extremely scarce. Ration cards were issued to control the supply of rice and other essentials. Each adult's monthly ration was 8 katis, or 4.8 kilograms of rice. But in early 1944, the ration was reduced to 6 katis.
Rice was a very important commodity. I believe that the Japanese authority used rice as a kind of a weapon to seek population's cooperation with the army.
By 1945, the prices of consumer goods had risen astronomically since their pre-war level. The price of eggs rose 500 times and rice 1,000 times. Rice became a priceless commodity.
When rice are being taken from the go down along the Singapore Harbour Board, the lorry has to pass through Cantonment Road area where I used to live. And there were many elderly Chinese women who used to sweep the road for rice which fell off from the lorries. We never imagined that war could bring such a situation of lifestyle.
The health of the general population was poor. Sanitary conditions had deteriorated and piped water was contaminated. The spread of disease was rampant.
The most common, I think, was tuberculosis in all stages. Then, of course, you had all the diarrheas and the malnutrition. That came up a bit later on, more and more cases of malnutrition. We had the bacterial diseases, we had typhoid, we had dysenteries. And the amazing thing is we've never had so many of these cases as during the occupation.
Towards the end of the war, living conditions became increasingly unbearable as food supplies dwindled. The Japanese currency depreciated rapidly due to overprinting. The tide of war was turning against the Japanese. The atomic bombs which fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki put an end to the Japanese occupation. On the 5th of September 1945, British and Commonwealth troops returned to Singapore. They received a tumultuous welcome. The same Union Jack was hoisted over the city, but it was a different Singapore to which the British returned in 1945. They were welcomed back with genuine relief, but the old loyalty and unquestioning trust in British protection had been shattered. A political awakening had taken place. After Singapore's defeat and 3.5 years of Japanese occupation, the people no longer regarded the British as infallible or superior. In another 10 years, the leaders of a new generation would emerge. People who had experienced the shock of the surrender, the horror of war, and the exhilaration of post-war winds of change. Leaders who would challenge the British right to rule.
September 1961, the day the Women's Charter came into effect. This signalled a turning point for Singapore women, ensuring them protection and equality. They could now forge ahead, unfettered by past restrictions. In the past, women's roles were limited. They were financially dependent on their menfolk and they had few opportunities for education.
Education for girls was still a privilege of the children of enlightened and well-to-do families, and the majority of girls and women stayed at home. The very poorest women had to work just for survival, and they did menial jobs.
Wives were vulnerable. If their husbands ill-treated or abandoned them, they had little means of finding jobs to support themselves and their children. A man who could afford to had more than one wife or concubines. He could also divorce his wife on minor grounds such as her being barren, disrespectful to his parents, or talkative. Each community had its own customary marriage practices and documents. Several clan associations organized mass weddings so that marriages had some measure of public acknowledgement. In the 1950s, several groups of women lobbied for changes in legislation to protect and give women legal rights. Women like the late Madam Chan Choi Seong, who was a member of the People's Action Party, rallied support from within the PAP. Pressure for reform legislation also came from other women who made the public aware of unequal treatment of women, women's problems and its effects on society in general. For the past 60 years, Mrs. Shireen Fodster has been campaigning on issues related to women. In the 1950s, her group had to deal with those who opposed the idea of equality for women on the grounds that it undermined traditional values. Her group also sought vital political support.
Then I had to go and see Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. To Chin Chai. They were both leaders of the PAP, and asked them what they would do if they came into power.
The new government set into motion the political and legal machinery to bring about the Women's Charter. The PAP's manifesto outlined important national issues, including a better life for women in independent Singapore. Marriage laws were to be amended to make polygamy illegal for all non-Muslims. It was felt that this would lead to a stable family. The Women's Charter, which came into operation on the 15th of September 1961. The Charter gave Singapore women individual legal rights. The new laws made marriage registration compulsory. It also covered divorce and offences against women and girls.
Be faithful to him so long as you both shall live.
Yes, I do.
If this ring,
I marry.
The public solemnization of a marriage made it a legal contract. After marriage, a woman continued to have her own legal rights. The Charter made it clear that she could retain her own surname, acquire, hold or dispose of property, be employed in any trade, profession or social activity, enter into contracts on her own. She can also sue and be sued in her own right. The Charter also specified grounds for divorce. A wife, for instance, who was unfairly treated could divorce her husband, who would legally still be expected to provide for her and their children. In this way, the Charter gave security to a woman who would otherwise be at her husband's mercy. The Women's Charter did not apply to Muslim wives as they were protected by Islamic laws. These laws, administered by the Sharia court, allowed a Muslim woman to petition for divorce. In cases where a Muslim woman was divorced, she could apply for a consolatory gift from her ex-husband. Even after the Charter, many couples still underwent traditional marriage ceremonies to retain their customs. But if something went wrong, women still had access to protection through the Charter.
I think women were in fact rather excited by this. It provided them protections that they had not had before. On the other hand, a number of middle-aged couples who had been married, say, during the Japanese War, when ceremonies were at a minimum, began to worry about their marriages, and some rather older groups went back to the registry in order to register their marriages, although in fact the law didn't require this.
In 1973, the government announced that all unregistered marriages after mid-1967 would not be recognized. There was then a scramble to get marriages registered, and the number of registrations rose by some 33% that year. Over the years, the Charter has been scrutinized and improved through a series of amendments. Review boards studied changing social needs and the initial impact of the Charter. The law now recognizes a wife's non-monetary contribution, entitling her to a share of the matrimonial property. A battered wife can get a court injunction ordering the husband not to assault her or the children. The 7-year period before divorce has been reduced to 3. And a woman petitioning for divorce is no longer responsible for finding the fault for the marriage breakdown anymore. Wong, who has researched divorce in Singapore, explains the practical implications of the amendments.
But under this new law, as long as there's good enough evidence to show irretrievable breakdown, this would actually minimize the trauma that the couple would have to go through, or the individual.
Today, the Charter has become so interwoven in the fabric of Singaporean life that some are quite unaware of it.
What are the laws? I have to do a bit of reading up first.
I don't really have very much comment on that. I think a lot of people have taken the Women's Charter for granted. Meanwhile, things have changed a lot for women. Women have come out in work, in all spheres of social and economic activities. And I think in this regard, they have not found it necessary to sort of keep referring back to the Women's Charter to assert their rights.
Legislation alone, however, does not ensure a better quality of life. While the Charter may have set the pace and mood for progressive changes, one must also consider the effects of wider social political developments.
Apart from legislation, you need real opportunities for women in education, in employment, in all spheres of social and political life. And then, of course, society's attitude towards women and the recognition given to women's contributions to society would also need to open up and to change along with the times. So legislation alone is not enough, but it is basic, it is there, it provides women with some kind of a guarantee in case the woman needs to have recourse to the law.
Since the Charter was enacted, women have made use of education and employment opportunities and have acquired new roles. They are found in various levels of employment. Today, in a climate of equality, the Singapore woman can reach for whatever she aspires. Singapore, a garden city. But a green and clean Singapore didn't come about overnight. In the past, street scenes such as these were commonplace. The environmental condition of our streets were far from clean and hygienic. Being a small island with a high population density, indiscriminate littering and improper disposal of refuse posed a major health hazard to the population. Something had to be done. So 20 years ago, on 1st October 1968, a nationwide Keep Singapore Clean campaign was launched by the Prime Minister.
We have built, we have progressed, but there is no hallmark of success more distinctive and more meaningful than achieving our position as the cleanest and greenest city in South Asia.
The campaign was launched at a crucial period when major problems such as housing and unemployment were largely being solved. It was thus timely to instill in the people the need to upgrade their environment and quality of life. It was also the first time a massive campaign aimed at public education was carried out.
The campaign is unique in that it has been planned and conducted in a scale which has never been done before. It involves every man, woman and child, every employer, workman or housewife. It is the responsibility of everyone in Singapore to refrain from littering, as Singapore is one home and one garden for all of us.
In order to reach out to everyone, full publicity was given to the campaign.
To keep our city clean, our parks and beaches too. Just put your waste into a bin and see that others do. Keep your city like a bin, put your litter in a bin. Stop disease this simple way, think about it, start today.
One aspect of the campaign included the control of street hawkers, which numbered about 24,000. Food and vegetable waste dumped into the drains or left on the road by them further aggravated the situation. These street hawkers had to be cleared and recited into proper food centers and markets. To clean up the streets of Singapore was a mammoth task. In the past, refuse wasn't collected regularly and was often left on the sidewalks to rot. With the campaign, the cleansing and public service under the Ministry of Health was upgraded. Refuse and litter were collected and cleared every single day of the week without fail. Till today, this practice is still carried out 365 days a year. But the clearing of rubbish wasn't left to the government departments alone. At various constituencies, broomstick brigades such as these also joined in the battle to clear the surroundings of its litter and dirt. It was a mass community effort involving the old as well as the young. But for some, this responsibility seemed to stop only at their doorsteps. Public places were still being littered. People were indifferent. This long ingrained habit of the people had to be changed. For the first time, fines were introduced for littering offences. Those caught littering were summoned to court and could be fined up to $500. But fines acted only as a deterrent. More important was the need to create public awareness that it was everyone's duty to keep Singapore clean, to see beyond their own doorsteps and cultivate the habit of not polluting the environment. Successive campaigns further reinforced this message. In no time, there was a visible difference. Singapore was cleaner, and littering was no longer a major problem. Having tackled the problem of littering, further steps were taken to enhance the environment with greenery. This added another dimension, the transformation of Singapore into a garden city. The greening program was initiated by the Prime Minister as early as 1963, but it only gained momentum much later. Since 1971, Tree Planting Day is an annual affair. This is to encourage mass participation as well as to sustain the interest of the people in contributing towards the greening of a city. In the early 60s, relatively few trees could be found in the city area. The first step was to ensure that as many trees as possible were planted along major roads and streets. Previously, trees were grown from seedlings, which took at least 5 years to mature. But with the introduction of instant trees, the greening program was accelerated. At the same time, land was set aside for the development of parks and tree planting. In the late 70s, the Garden City concept was taken a step further. A greater variety of ornamental trees and shrubs were brought in to increase the range of plants available. Exotic flowers imported from other tropical countries were included to add dashes of color to Singapore's green landscape. Today, trees and flowers are found almost everywhere. Plants and flowering shrubs are also used to beautify concrete structures such as these. The greening program has been successful due to widespread efforts to find suitable plant species, but the maintenance and nurturing of the greenery requires just as much effort. Today, 20 years later, Singapore has become a clean and green city. Since 1970, some 4.5 million trees, shrubs and climbers have been planted. And today, there are 38 parks developed for our recreational needs. With greater affluence and a higher standard of living, the environment and the quality of life now assume greater importance. A city that's clean and green not only meets the aesthetic needs of the people, but also reflects the people themselves.
I, Kwan Prak Kin, do further solemnly swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the Republic of Singapore, and that I will observe the laws and be the true, loyal and faithful citizen of Singapore.
Sign your name is where you do it. So over here.
This simple ceremony has remained unchanged over 30 years. It took less than 5 minutes, but it marked a change in their lives. The year was 1957, and the people, immigrants who had decided to make good their homes in Singapore. The bill that made it all possible, the Singapore Citizenship Ordinance, passed on 16th October 1957. Under British rule, there had been no such thing as Singapore citizenship. It was possible to become naturalized British subjects, but that was too expensive for most people. Besides, the Chinese immigrants felt more attached to the island than the British Crown. In the 40s, local Chinese leader Lien Yin-chow took up their cause. Through the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, he suggested to the British that all immigrants who had been here for 8 years or more should be given Singapore citizenship. However, the colonial authorities were reluctant to grant a special kind of citizenship to the immigrants on the island. They doubted the loyalty of the immigrants to Singapore because many of them continued to maintain close ties with their motherland. Circumstances changed in the 50s. At that time, the British decided to grant Singapore self-rule, but there were difficulties involved. Only about half the population in Singapore were British subjects and had the right to vote. The other half, the immigrants, had no voting rights, but were not a force to be dismissed easily. Many of them had begun to regard the island as home. They were sending fewer remittances to their motherland. And scenes like these, of sending fellow immigrants back to China, had become rare. The Labour Front governments of David Marshall and Lim Yew Hock discussed this issue with the British during constitutional talks in London in 1956 and 57. They felt that granting Singapore citizenship to the immigrants would help integrate them fully into society. The colonial authorities finally allowed the creation of Singapore citizenship and agreed to amend the British Nationality Act to recognize all Singapore citizens as British subjects.
Probably the origin of the idea was the British did not trust that the Chinese would have loyalty to Singapore because there were many immigrants. So Marshall's idea and Lim Yew Hock's idea and our government's idea was that if you give them a stake in the country, a sense of belonging to a country, slowly, instead of their loyalty being to China, which was communist at that time, their loyalty may turn to Singapore.
During that time, civics courses were organized to teach the population the meaning of citizenship and to help them understand better the work of the government so that national solidarity could be enhanced. During these sessions, which lasted 1 to 2 days each, housewives, school teachers, hawkers, taxi drivers, students and many others attended lectures, visited government departments and met with ministers. When finally approved, the Singapore Citizenship Ordinance recognized all local-born as Singapore citizens. Immigrants who had lived here for at least 8 years could register for citizenship. A 3-month campaign for citizenship was launched, starting from November 1957. Mobile teams such as this at the Fort Canning Centre were sent to various locations throughout the island to register new citizens. Registration was made fast and simple to enable more people to vote at the next general elections scheduled for 1959. The response was overwhelming. Hours of registration had to be extended. In the first month alone, 90,000 new citizens were registered, Chinese, Indian and Malay. At the end of 3 months, 325,000 had given up their immigrant status and become citizens. One of the first was Lien Yin-chow.
After I register as a Singapore citizen, I'm very happy. I feel the hard work I work together with the Chamber of Commerce and other people now succeed.
Apabila saya menerima sertifikat kerajaan ini, saya begitu gembira sekali. Dan terbayang di pemikiran saya bahawa satu ketika nanti saya akan menetap di Singapura dan bekerja di Singapura.
Almost all the eligible Chinese immigrants, about 200,000 in all, became citizens, many of whom registered at the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce. The registration exercise doubled Singapore's electoral role, incorporating the Indian and Chinese immigrant communities into the political life of the island. From across the seas they had come, each chasing a dream, but eventually setting up a permanent home here. Together with the Malay community, they became the ones from whom a new nation developed in 1965. These new citizens changed voting patterns in Singapore, casting that decisive vote in the 1959 general elections, which gave a young party, the People's Action Party, political leadership during the next few decades. Political developments since then, such as merger with Malaysia and later the creation of an independent country, demanded the adoption of new and tighter citizenship laws. The 1957 ordinance has hence been superseded, but more significantly, Singapore's citizenship has taken on a new meaning.
Giving citizenship means that you said this is your country. Now, we didn't expect this idea to mature in the minds of people for at least a generation. And as you can see now, it took more than a generation. When the older generation is phased off and the younger generation are born here and they're from school taught to be loyal to the country, to this country, and to look to Singapore as their own country. They may look to the mother country for culture and for other ties, but for loyalty they would say this is my country, and today you can see that has happened.
Years ago this day marked the passage of the Singapore Polytechnic Act and the establishment of a new institution of higher learning. The early Singapore Polytechnic was modelled along British lines. Many of the staff were expatriates and a wide variety of courses were offered. These ranged from specialised technical courses in engineering, building and architecture to popular commercial and secretarial courses in stenography and typing. Polytechnic senior lecturer Mr. Lim Ming Tong was a student in the architecture and building course more than 2 decades ago.
I remember during that time we have a very small class of 10 students only. The class is small, so we know each other very well. And but one thing I want to say is that during that time the facilities wasn't that advanced. We have only a few labs.
Before the 1950s, technical training received little attention. Singapore relied on entrepôt trade as its main economic activity. Its middleman's role for the region provided a source of livelihood for many. But towards the 1950s, the commercial and service sectors alone could not sustain an increasing population. It was imperative for Singapore to diversify her economy and reduce her traditional dependence on entrepôt trade. This economic outlook propelled the issue of technical education to the forefront. In 1953, the colonial government appointed a committee under Professor Dobie to explore the feasibility of establishing a polytechnic. Based on the Dobie report, steps were taken to set up a polytechnic for Singapore. A site at Shanton Circus was chosen for its central location. Construction began soon afterwards, but even before its completion, courses were already conducted at borrowed premises. Classes commenced at the new Prince Edward Road campus, which was built at a cost of about $8 million. It had an initial enrollment of about 400 full-time and 2,500 part-time students. (1959) saw the opening of the Singapore Polytechnic by Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. The year of its opening marks not only an important chapter of the Polytechnic's history, but also coincided with a significant phase in the political development of Singapore. Colonial rule came to an end after 140 years, and Singapore attained self-government. At this crucial point of Singapore's history, a vital role was envisaged for the country's new polytechnic. The selection of its courses was re-examined by the new government.
At that point of time, there was a hodgepodge of courses in the polytechnic without a clear definition of what its main line should be. There were craft courses, there were certificate courses, there were diploma courses. Some of these were attuned to requirements of British institutions. British institutions have their own standards geared to British industry. We did not have British industry in Singapore, so it was necessary therefore to reorient the polytechnic so that we produce technicians for Singapore industries and for industries to come.
In keeping with the new emphasis on industrialization, courses in general education and secretarial skills were discontinued. The remaining courses were reorganized into 4 departments: engineering, building and architecture, nautical studies, and accountancy. A local examination system with internal and external examiners also replaced the previous system of overseas examinations. Further, in 1963, in line with the development needs of Singapore, the Polytechnic transferred its craft courses to vocational institutes and concentrated on courses solely for technicians and professionals. In the mid-60s, exploratory measures were taken to develop the Polytechnic into a technological university with degree-conferring status. As a first step, temporary arrangements were made with the University of Singapore so that its degrees could be awarded to the Polytechnic's professional level students. 1969 witnessed the beginning of another important phase in the Polytechnic's history. Further reorganization took place. Professional level courses in engineering, architecture and building, and accountancy were transferred to the University of Singapore. From then on, the Polytechnic would only conduct technical courses and would devote its energies to the training of middle-level technical personnel to meet the demands of industry. Mr. Khoo Kay Chai has been the principal of the Singapore Polytechnic since 1976. He was a senior lecturer with the institution when the reorganization of the Polytechnic took place.
Quite naturally, many staff were disappointed with the loss and transfer of professional courses to the university. However, there were others who understood the reason for this change. They saw the new mission for the Poly as one that presents them with interesting, fresh challenges. Singapore needed a large number of well-trained technologists to support our industrialization program. So we had to train a large number and of the right quality to meet the demands of our industry.
Meanwhile, enrollment at the Polytechnic expanded rapidly. The Ayer Rajah and Dover Road feeder campuses were used to house the additional intake of students. The combined enrollment in 1970 was about 5,000. In 1979, the Polytechnic found its new home on the sprawling complex in Dover Road. Today, situated on an extensive 37-hectare site with a student population of 13,000, the Singapore Polytechnic ranks among the largest technical training institutions in the world. The Polytechnic offers a total of 39 full-time and part-time courses, leading to diploma and certificate awards. These courses are designed to train the engineering technologist to meet the demands of industry and the public sector.
This number of colors you can have.
The Polytechnic's wide-ranging courses in engineering, chemical process technology, business administration and maritime studies emphasizes practical training and industrial application. The availability of modern facilities and industrial equipment gives students the chance for practical hands-on exposure. In the 34 years of its history, the Polytechnic has trained about 45,000 graduates. The Polytechnic's training of skilled technician engineers forms an indispensable part of the country's industrial, engineering and economic life. As Singapore moves into a higher technological phase of development, the Polytechnic continues to adapt and expand its curriculum to train the right caliber of people to meet the high-tech challenge of industries.
31st October 1973. After months of preparation, buses of the newly formed Singapore Bus Service rolled out for their trial run from Changi to Jurong. This was a new era in the history of Singapore's public transport. Once there were 11 bus companies on the island, but now only one, the SBS. Under colonial rule, public transport in Singapore was left to private enterprise. Those who could afford it provided their own transport. Others walked. And the more enterprising ones made a living by transporting others. One of the first passenger transport companies that was set up was the Singapore Traction Company, formed in 1925. European-owned, it began by operating trolley buses. It was given certain privileges by the colonial authorities. For instance, it had the license to operate the busiest and most lucrative routes within the city. As passenger loads increased, its fleet expanded to 400, and by 1953, these were replaced by petrol-driven buses. Out in the rural areas, on the other hand, public transport was badly neglected. Seeing the economic potential, enterprising Chinese businessmen set up their own bus companies to ply these areas. There were 10 such companies, and these included the Tekoyat and Hockley bus companies. Most of them were family-owned. They were relatively small, and their routes were few. And unlike the STC, they were not allowed to operate in city areas. Up till the 50s, the bus service was inconvenient for commuters. Those traveling to the city had to change buses, and much time was wasted on waiting. Besides, most of the bus companies were badly managed, and this resulted in bus disputes. Poor working conditions, low pay, and a restive bus union. In the 50s, all this led to work stoppages and strikes, which disrupted bus services. Such incidents included the Hockley bus riots and the strike by the Tekoyat Bus Company in 1955. The strikes gave pirate taxis a flourishing business, and this ate into the earnings of the bus companies. Nothing much was done to improve the bus system during the Labour Front government. In the early 60s, the bus companies were left to develop on their own. The Tekoyat Company, for example, set up its own assembly plant. It was only in 1965 that an effort was made to improve our bus transport system. A government committee recommended that bus routes should be reorganized to avoid the duplication of routes. To ensure fair competition, privileges previously given to the STC were removed. The government encouraged the 10 Chinese bus companies to amalgamate into 3 larger companies. Their buses took on a new coat of paint to reflect this change. The associated bus services serving the east, the United Bus Company in the north, and the Amalgamated Bus Company in the western part of the island. Faced with this new competition, the STC found it difficult to survive. At the end of 1971, its buses returned to the depot for the last time, and the company called it a day. Its fleet was absorbed by the Chinese bus companies. But having a larger fleet only complicated matters for them. For a start, many of the buses were too old to be on the roads. Besides, many of the Chinese bus operators did not trust each other and continued to operate as though they were individual companies. Even with the reorganization, the bus companies continued to be poorly managed.
以前我们分配给我们坐的车啊，时常啊都是那些比较跟那配车员比较好的啦，有说有私利的或者跟他有来往的，他们就叫的比较好的车了。那些比较跟他这些配车员啊不合作或是怎样啊，他们时常都是没得做，或是做要给他们做都是那些车有毛病的，时常跑到半路就坏车了，这些种种的事。是的，车啊是很陈旧了，好像啊那个制止器啊就不灵了，你这边踩不灵啊，要很远才会停啊。
The problem was compounded by increased traffic on the roads. The government had to curb the car population, but before it could do this, the bus system had to be improved so that there would be better alternative transport. It was believed that this could be achieved by having only one bus company. The Chinese bus companies then decided to merge into an even bigger company, and so in 1973, the Singapore Bus Service was formed. SBS buses began running officially on the 1st of November 1973. While it inherited the fleets of its component bus companies, it also took on all their problems. More than half the buses broke down at one time. Finally, a government team joined the SBS to help solve its problems.
We want to establish a totally new, modern organization, completely different from the old setup. The next goal that we set up was that we must show immediate improvement in the level of services we provided to the members of the public. There shouldn't be this frequent breakdown of buses, dirty buses, and rude conductors and buses coming to bus stops and not stopping, even when passengers were signaling for them to stop.
SBS underwent many changes during this period. New blood was injected into the management, the buying of new and better buses, and the implementation of tighter discipline and a modern management system. All these took SBS on the road to better service. Since then, SBS has not looked back. It has worked hard to earn itself the recognition it has today as an efficient bus company that consistently looks into providing better public transport for this island. November 1971. British troops leave Singapore, ending 152 years of their presence on the island. The British administration had helped Singapore grow into a thriving port from a mere fishing village in Stamford Raffles's time. In the 1960s, Singapore was doing especially well. Much of this could be due to the British military presence in Singapore. There were 30,000 troops stationed here, and altogether 24,000 local civilians were working in the bases, in ship repair and the servicing of aeronautics and ammunition supplies. And the livelihood of about 70,000 more were indirectly dependent on the British community. More than $450 million a year was spent by the British. All this contributed to our economic growth in the 60s. After the Second World War, Britain was still one of the largest naval forces in the world. Because of our strategic position, Singapore was chosen as one of Britain's 3 naval bases. In fact, Singapore was known as the Gibraltar of the East. Even after we became independent, we could only boast of 2 regiments of our very own. So the presence of the British forces was vital to our defense. We relied on them for protection in the sea and in the air. Then, in November 1967, sterling was devalued. Britain was in trouble economically. She decided she could no longer spend over $1 million a day to maintain troops out in the Far East. Troop withdrawal was announced in January 1968. Suddenly, confidence in Singapore clouded. Without stability, investors might stop coming in. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew flew to London to negotiate with the Labour government. Pulling out 30,000 troops so suddenly would jeopardize our economy. Also, there was no time to build up our own defence forces. Mr. Lee put our case before the British in an interview on the BBC.
The security of the whole region will be very seriously jeopardized unless some rapid rearrangements are made to ensure continuing security, without which there is no confidence, and without confidence, the boom that we have been having in industrial expansion, so much so now that we haven't got one single industrial site vacant. They've all been taken up by investors, a large number of whom have come from Hong Kong. And if we don't have that continuing security, then, as I wrote to Mr. Dennis Healy recently, all the significant aid in the world will be of little value. What we want is security and confidence, and we can do the economic side mainly by ourselves.
The British government agreed to delay troop withdrawal for a few months till November 1971. In the meantime, the British were to help convert all the bases for commercial use. Singapore set up a base economic conversion department to negotiate the details with the British. Finally, it was decided that Britain would leave all their military installations behind, which occupied 1/10 of Singapore's land. They also promised another $370 million to help cushion the adverse effects of the pullout. The HM Naval Dockyard in Sembawang was one of the biggest bases, employing 5,000 workers. A British firm was brought in to turn the naval dockyard into a commercial ship repair and maintenance yard. It became the new government-owned company, Sembawang Shipyard. While it continued to service the Navy till the pullout, it also began taking on the repair of commercial ships. But many things had to change.
Well, the workshops in the naval dockyard and the berths and the cranes are pretty substantial, but what the property needed was a new dry dock, a big dry dock. Then there were things that we had to do in readjusting the mixture of the people. They liked perhaps too many joiners, maybe not enough steel workers, and so some retraining and some rebalancing amongst the workforce. Then, of course, we had to build up the management. There was virtually no local management, so we had to do that. In the longer term, of course, the main thing would be the matter of changing the attitudes from that of a naval, a government-type organization to one of a commercial tempo, round-the-clock working and so on.
It was a very tense time for the new management. They didn't know how the workers would take to the new paymasters. Were they unhappy? Would they go on strike?
Well, there was some concern that a similar thing could have happened here to what happened in Malta when the dockyard was transferred there. And there the thing was done rather badly, and the workforce, in fact, rioted on the transfer date. So I suppose the Navy or the British Admiralty people were concerned that a similar thing might happen here. So there were precautions taken, in fact. It's no secret now, perhaps, that the riot squad was tucked away in workshops. But in fact, it went off extremely peacefully, and nothing untoward happened. People left the shipyard on the Saturday, employees of the Admiralty, and came back on the Monday morning, employees of Sembuang shipyard.
Commercial ships began coming in for repairs. Business boomed. When going public 5 years later, the company managed to get $51 million for their shares. Throughout Singapore, 24,000 workers were made redundant by the pullout. Many found jobs in other industries, but 9,000 of them had no skills and faced retrenchment. So, with aid from Britain, an industrial training center was set up. There, clerks learned to use a lathe, and joiners became plumbers in 3 short months. Jurong was made the center of industrial activity. Multinationals were given generous tax and export incentives if they chose to set up here. Meanwhile, our defense program was put into full swing. Back in 1967, a bill was passed making it mandatory for young men to serve in the army. So a massive recruitment and training program was launched to build up Singapore's defenses. So what had been only 2 local regiments was built up to 50,000 troops just before the British left. Britain's decision to pull out the troops provided the impetus for Singapore to take over the responsibility for its own defense. To avert a potentially difficult economic period, Singapore also had to accelerate the pace of industrialization. Retrenched workers were given a chance to retrain themselves to fit into new areas of a burgeoning economy. So when the British finally withdrew in 1971, Singapore was prepared to face the challenges ahead. It had turned adversity into advantage.
A place with the world at their fingertips. The National Library, opened on 12 November 1960 by the young Pertuan Negara Yusof bin Ishak. The week that that followed was declared National Library Week. There were talks and exhibitions on books. The idea for a library was first mooted by Lee Kong Chien, a well-known philanthropist who donated $375,000 to the library building. In 1955, the Public Works Department drew up plans for a T-shaped brick building. The design was wholly functional, with 3 main sections for the children's, adult lending and reference services. The project cost $2.5 million. It was built right next to the museum on a site that had been occupied by the British Council. The library had its beginnings in the Raffles Library, housed in the museum since 1887. Only English books were available, catering to the British expatriates and to the English educated. There was a 3-tier subscription fee, and though it was not expensive, it did keep the general public away. In 1958, however, subscriptions were abolished with the implementation of the National Library Act. Within 12 months, membership grew 1.5 times. The new library building was completed in 1960, and books were moved over in November the same year. Many hands helped in the effort.
There were about 50 staff at that time, and we formed a human chain because the old library was not really very far from the new library. And we packed up all the books in parcels, first of all, and we worked out where all the parcels of books would go, to which rooms, and so on. And then we, passed the books in this human chain from one to the other. And it took us about a week or so, and then rearranging the books on the shelves and getting everything tidied up.
Unlike the former Raffles Library, readers found themselves with ample room. The National Library was ready for business, even if some furniture had still to arrive.
So when people came in, they said, well, where are the seats, and are we expected to read standing up? You see, at the shelves. And people came out of curiosity, just as, they do today. Whenever there's a new building, I think people rush to see it, like Changi Airport or other things. And at that time, of course, it was a big new building. And people just came and walked around and looked at the books. Not all of them joined.
But getting more members and more books were just what the library aimed to do. In 1959, it had begun to buy Chinese, Malay and Tamil books so that there would be books for all, not just those who could read English. In 1960, non-English books made up only 14% of the total collection. By 1970, this had risen to a third, and today, half the books are in other languages. To select books in the different languages and to promote their use, bilingual staff had to be hired. They were hard to come by. In those early days, few people could read and write in more than one language. Children were frequent visitors to the library. The 1957 census showed that only half our population could read, and most of the literate were young people. There was a need to increase literacy and encourage the use of reference materials, especially among students.
We wanted to develop the reference and information services because we saw that was very badly needed at that time, that people needed to be kept well informed. Those were the days, in the 60s when there was a great deal of political turmoil, what with merger and then, the battle for merger and then separation and so on. So the public had to be kept very well informed of government's policies.
To reach out to more people, mobile services to schools in the rural areas were started in 1960. There was only one van, bought with a US $2,000 donation from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and it went round to 35 schools. This school service continued for 2 years. In 1964, the van went on the road again, this time going to community centres. By 1969, it went to 12 different locations. The van was a welcome sight wherever it went. With the adults away at work, most of the readers were children. There was little space for movement, so not more than 10 at a time were allowed in the van. Though small, the staff were dedicated. Mr. Chan Tai Sing recalls what they did when the van broke down.
There was only one van, so we had to probably charter taxis or ask staff cars to help, especially when they were on the way to a service point, and we did not want to disappoint the readers. So we saw to it that the books arrived at the service point when it was supposed to start.
There were part-time libraries too. These were located at community centres and later in void decks of HDB blocks. They opened for several hours 2 or 3 days a week. The books were kept in cupboards or rooms that were locked up when the library was closed. The libraries had an ardent following. One of them was Asula Kwa, who joined the library at Siglap Community Centre.
I was a schoolgirl at that time, and I would be there promptly at 2, in fact, a little bit before 2, waiting for the doors to open. And then once I got in, I would make a beeline to the counter. There was only one librarian. We were only allowed to have to take 2 books at a time, so I would rush home. I lived directly opposite the library, so I'd rush home with my books and read as fast as I could. And about 7:45, I would be back in the library to get another 2 books, and this would be enough to tide me over for Wednesday. And then Thursday, 2 o'clock, I'll be back in the library again.
For those who loved to read but could not afford books, the library and its branches provided a free and abundant supply. The National Library played another important role in the students' lives in the 60s and 70s. Housing conditions were cramped and many used it as a place for studying. But in 1980, with home ownership growing, it was felt that most people could now study at home. Studying in the library was discouraged to make room for those using library facilities. In the 70s, the library expanded its role, organizing magic shows and talks. Gradually, it became a center for community activities. As literacy grew and housing estates spread, more libraries were needed, so full-time branches were opened in satellite towns. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew opened the first of these branches in Queenstown on 30th April 1970. Nearby, part-time libraries were closed and readers transferred to these brand new, better equipped libraries. The Prime Minister described the Queenstown Library as a milestone in our rising standards of life. It was to be the first of many more full-time branches. Toa Payoh was opened in 1974. Marine Parade in 1978. Bukit Merah in 1982. Ang Mo Kio in 1985. And Bedok also in 1985. All these branches are linked together by computer to coordinate their activities. Computers also provide access to other libraries, both locally and abroad. Today, the library has become more than a place just for books. Tapes on dance, art and music are found in the Arts Resource Centre. Improvement has also meant specialization. In the Southeast Asian Room, an extensive collection of materials on Singapore and her neighbours has become an important source of information on the region. These changes are part of the ongoing development of the library, an evolution that grows with the people's needs. As our lifestyles change, so will the role of the library, providing knowledge for the people.
common scene all over Singapore throughout most of 1963. The Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, was visiting the constituencies, 51 of them in all. The visits first began on the 24th of November 1962 in rural Jurong. This was a difficult place to start. 50% of the voters in Jurong had earlier cast protest votes in the referendum for merger with Malaya. The Prime Minister visited them to make them understand that the merger was vital to Singapore's survival and to draw them closer to the government. Next, on the 15th of December, it was Thomson, another rural constituency. From then on, the tours gained momentum. From the rural to the urban, constituency after constituency, they increased from once in 2 weeks to 5 times a week. The people turned out in large numbers to see the Prime Minister.
People heard so much about him, and of course the majority of the rural people, they came out to meet the man who promised them so much in the new government. Some came out of curiosity, some just want to know what he looks like, and some just want to have the pleasure of speaking to him.
The personal contact was very important at a time when the population was largely illiterate, and most people could not afford the luxury of television. Living conditions were poor, and many were struggling just to make ends meet. Housing and unemployment were the problems of the day. The Prime Minister listened to the people, their complaints and their views, demonstrating that the government was a caring one, willing to learn about the difficulties and lend a helping hand. In turn, they listened to him. The tours provided a very good platform from which government policies relating to specific localities could be explained directly to the people.
This is about the most expensive standpipe in Singapore, for we spent $36,000 to put the standpipe up. And I want to make clear why we did it, because there's bound to be a lot of other kampongs who say that they also should have a $36,000 standpipe. Because in this case, having laid on this standpipe, we were at the same time able to hive off 5 other standpipes to serve 5 other areas. In other words, although it was $36,000 for this one, 5 other places also got the benefit.
At various places, Mr. Lee stopped to open community centers and schools. He also heard petitions on issues that related directly to the immediate needs of the people: street lights, standpipes, and even drinking water. All these were taken note of.
At the time there, it was just those old-fashioned street lights with a little tiny bulb on a pole. Now, slowly, they were changed to fluorescent tubes. And in the kampongs where street lights or pathway lights were not provided, they allowed private contractors to come in and charge residents a small fee for lighting up the roads. Now, these brought more life to the kampong at night.
Haji Muhammad, who lived on Pulau Sudong, recalls how he and his neighbors had to brave rough waves to go to the neighboring islands for their water supply. This difficulty was brought up during the Prime Minister's visit, and they saw some results.
Dia minta lah satu dibikinkan apa ni, air lah, untuk dihantarkan apa daripada Singapura kat sini. Jadi dia supply pakai kapal air lah.
Problems and difficulties were quickly resolved. But a young nation could not take economic growth, stability and security for granted. So while the Prime Minister dealt with issues at the personal level, he also wanted the people to focus their attention on wider issues.
I come to Nee Soon to look after the small things, drains, roads, electric lights, water pipes, and so on. But the small things depends on the big things. Merger, stability, security, economic development. If we've got that, then we've got prosperity, then the taxes will pay for the roads, the lights, the community centers, the clinics, the people's welfare.
The crowds listened as he spoke in their own language, showing his sincerity and earnestness.
我来访问宜春区是为了小事情了，小问题。Nasib rakyat mesti selalu jaga. 國家無穩定，咱的經濟無發展，經濟制度是無發展。
But there were those who opposed the Prime Minister and his policies. In one instance, he was pushed and almost fell into a monsoon drain. But all these did not deter the Prime Minister. He persevered on, and with a dedicated group of community leaders, he completed the tours, down to the last constituency. These community leaders were steadfast in their mission. They accompanied the Prime Minister on his visits, many of which started early in the morning and lasted all day long. In Bukit Panjang, for example, the tour took 10 hours, covering some 14 villages. The longest of the tours was at Sembawang. It lasted 18 hours and ended only at 3 a.m. The last tour was at Mountbatten, and it ended only at 6:15 in the morning of September the 12th, 1963. A few hours after that, the Prime Minister was at the nomination centre to formalize his candidacy in the 1963 general election, in which the PAP won 37 of the 51 seats.
It is a breakthrough between the people and the government and those who are elected to govern, because they see for the first time that the government is taking an interest, coming down to visit them and find out their problems. The important thing is that a few months after the PMB, improvements were seen, visibly seen. There were more street lights, the roads were surfaced, and there were improvements. And these little improvements helped to build up confidence in the new party at the time.
A valuable experience drawn from the past, which the leaders today have benefited from. Hence their own series of walkabouts, beginning in October 1983. The masses can now follow the proceedings of Parliament on television and read about government policies in newspapers. But there's still nothing quite like the personal touch when it comes to winning the hearts and minds of the people.
They gathered outside the gates, picketing and chanting slogans, preventing other students from entering the schools to sit for the exams. The day was 27th November 1961, and these students were protesting against having to sit for a government examination introduced for Secondary 4 students in Chinese schools. This was not the first time that Chinese students had agitated against the authorities. In 1954, they took to the streets to protest against British attempts to introduce national service in Singapore. A year later, in the Hockley bus dispute, they provided much emotional support and material aid to the striking bus workers, supporting a strike which escalated into a violent riot. And when the government decided to close their schools to instill discipline among the students, they organized a sit-in. Those days, Chinese school students were fired by the call for independence to end colonial rule, and many were inspired by events in China.
当时学生活动呢，一般人士啊，感觉到他们是左倾啊。那么这个左倾原因呢，我们可以说，因为当时是殖民地时代，那么大家我们是华人，都认为中国是我们的祖国，是吧？中华文化是我们的根。那么中国当时呢是共产党执政，当然是左了。所以呢，无形中呢，学生的就倾向于左。
Since they were first set up in the 18th century, Chinese schools in Singapore were patterned after those in China. Teachers and even textbooks came from there. For the Chinese, education was an important way of preserving their language and culture, and they were therefore very proud of their schools. There were English schools, but these were mainly set up by the Europeans, and they functioned on a different system. In the late 50s, however, the government saw a need to unify the educational system. Singapore was moving away from the crutches of colonial rule, and it became necessary for all schools to have the same curriculum. The government recommended that the Chinese school system be changed to follow that of the English schools. There was no change at the primary level, as primary education would still be 6 years. But the change affected the secondary schools. Previously, Chinese school students attended 3 years of lower middle and another 3 years of senior middle school, with examinations set by the schools themselves. But now, just as in English schools, they would have to attend 4 years of secondary school, at the end of which they would sit for an examination set by the government. Only after passing the exam would they be able to do 2 more years of pre-university. This new system was implemented in 1959, but there were those in the Chinese community who did not like the change.
他们同时呢也怀疑政府呢有意要改制，是要把华文中学改制同英校一样，慢慢的把华校变制为英校。 这样呢，就把华校破坏了，最后呢，消灭华文教育。
The students took up this issue in July 1961, the year the first government exams for secondary 4 students were to be held. They were very much against the fact that they had to pass their secondary 4 exam before they could do pre-university. They were supported by pro-communist elements in the Barisan Socialists, a newly formed party set up by former members of the People's Action Party. Many believe that the Barisan Socialists was the main influence behind the student agitation, and that the party was using the issue to arouse discontent among the people. Two days before the exams, some 5,000 students gathered at the Chinese high school for a meeting. There they took a combined decision to boycott the exam. On the first day of the exam, they gathered outside the various exam centers. The students chanted slogans, clapped hands and sang to keep their spirits up. They masked their faces with handkerchiefs and wore black armbands to mourn the death of Chinese education. Some who had turned up for the exam were persuaded to boycott it. Others were prevented from entering the exam centers. Over the next few days, the boycott continued to gain momentum. Most of the 18 examination venues had to be closed. The students even picketed outside the Ministry of Education.
在教育部的那个入口处，主要入口处的话呢，也集中了很多学生在那边。这些学生的话呢，慢慢的也越来越多，越来越多的话，他们也在那边，当然了，唱歌啦，喊口号啦。
Temporary exam venues had to be found. In the end, only 3 centres were opened for the exams. But despite the boycott, more than half the candidates sat for the examinations. This was mainly due to the efforts of their parents, who were undeterred by the boycotting students. They accompanied their children to the exam venues and were prepared to push their way through the human blockade. The government had not used the police, but instead convinced the parents that sitting for the exams would be in their children's best interests.
Student boycott examination, no police. I use the police, students are injured, Chinese education being destroyed. I just tell the parents, look, your boy misses this examination, he loses 1 year. The parent sits back for 24 hours, thinks about it, grabs hold of his son, breaks the picket line, goes in and sees that his son is in the examination.
Without the support of the parents, the boycott simply failed. This marked a turning point in the attitude of Chinese secondary school students. Slowly, a new generation of students was emerging. They saw the importance of education and the need to advance themselves. The political climate was also changing. Under a government that was popularly elected, the people were beginning to witness changes for the better. And as the immigrant communities began to regard Singapore as home, they were prepared to leave the turbulence of the 50s behind and to accept the need for change.
Ceremony, I feel a sense of pride. The flag reminds me that when I grow up, I can do something for my country.
What really stirs me up is the rousing tune and the encouraging words, Majulah Singapura, Fort Singapore.
Sekolah, ready, go!
Patriotic, especially when I sing out the national anthem with the lyrics, for example, Majulah Singapura, go forward for Singapore as a nation, with Bahagia, which means peace and harmony.
And every day singing the pledge, I feel that I'm renewing my pledge of allegiance to Singapore and to be loyal to Singapore.
This flag-raising ceremony had its beginnings 29 years ago this day, when the red and white flag of Singapore was hoisted and unfurled for the first time to the accompaniment of the new state anthem, Majulah Singapura. The historic day on the 3rd of December 1959 witnessed the installation of a new head of state, the young Di-Pertuan Negara, and signified Singapore's emergence from 140 years of colonial rule. Before a Padang rally, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew said,
Men have died for the honor and glory of their flag. men have rallied and united in instinctive response to their anthems. Small country though we may be, it is nevertheless necessary that we develop these instinctive emotional responses so vital to the survival of a people.
In 1959, Singapore had a population of 1.5 million people. Most of the adult citizens were immigrants who still owed their loyalties to their countries of origin. Fewer than half of the 600,000 voters then were not born and raised here. The newly elected government saw an urgent need to instill common loyalties and common values among the different ethnic groups. The new coat of arms, the state flag, and the national anthem were seen as symbols to evoke a sense of pride and belonging in a new generation of Singapore citizens. Dr. Toh Chin Chai, former Deputy Prime Minister who headed a committee which created these symbols, including the flag, recalls.
The whole idea then was to get a flag that was distinctively Singapore. And nobody else can confuse the Singapore flag with somebody else's flag. So I was in favor of one color, red. But I knew I would not be able to get away with it because, again, red at that time was associated with the Communist Party. In fact, left-wing trade unions used to irritate the police by flying pieces of red cloth outside the union premises. So you have to understand in the early 1950s, with the emergency on and armed struggle conducted by Malayan Communist Party, there were great sensitivities. We had to be very politically sensitive.
The committee finally chose red, symbolizing equality and brotherhood, and white, representing purity and virtue. It wanted to add 3 stars to symbolize democracy, justice, and progress. But there were problems.
I was a bit anxious that putting 3 stars on the Singapore flag will lead to uneasiness among some people that we are associated with the Malayan Communist Party, because the Malayan Communist Party also has 3 stars on the caps. Because of this, we added 2 more stars to represent prosperity and peace.
Then, a crescent moon was added to the flag.
That was an idea which I thought was quite good because the crescent moon represents a newly independent country. At the same time, I showed the Malays, in particular the Muslims, that we are not a Chinese state.
The state arms was also decided at the same time. It consists of a lion and a tiger holding up a shield containing a crest of a crescent moon with 5 stars. The animals stand on a scroll bearing the words Majulah Singapura. The tiger and the lion symbolize Singapore's unity with the Federation of Malaya. The crescent moon shows that the state is new and rising. Together with the crest and flag, a national anthem was sought to replace God Save the Queen. A Malay composer, Zubir Said, was chosen to write the national anthem. Zubir Said was well known as a composer of patriotic songs, as well as songs for Cathay Chris, a local movie company.
My problem was how to compose a song that would be acceptable to all in the national language. The words had to be kept short. I had to take into consideration the conditions existing in Singapore at that time and in which direction it was heading. In those days, 1956, 1957, there was already the spirit of nationalism, the spirit to be a free people and an independent nation. I could feel it emerging.
It took Zubir Syed, or Pak Zubir as he's affectionately known, 6 weeks to compose Majulah Singapura, a rousing march which means May Singapore prosper. The Singapore Chamber Ensemble first sang the original version of Zubir Syed's composition at the Victoria Theatre.
Majulah Singapura was never really written as the Singapore national anthem. It was really written earlier on as a choral composition for another occasion, for the opening of the renovated Victoria Theatre. Mr. Zubir Syed, who wrote that choral piece, was looking for a choir to sing this composition of his, and he was asked to approach me, which he did. The members of the choir sang it and enjoyed it immensely because the words were easy to learn and memorize, and the words reflected many of the sentiments of the time, sentiments calling for working together, moving forward together, standing together, and standing solidly as one people. When the government was looking for a suitable piece of music that they could use as a national anthem for Singapore, instead of commissioning somebody to write an anthem, they thought they could use this piece of music and invited Mr. Zubir Syed to try and modify it so that it could be used as a national anthem.
The state flag, national emblem and the state anthem were unanimously adopted by MPs from both the ruling party and the opposition in the Legislative Assembly on the 11th of November 1959. The symbols were shown to the people for the first time at a gathering of 25,000 at the Padang to witness a significant milestone in our history. A 300-strong school choir, comprising students from the different language schools, led in the singing of the anthem. They were accompanied by members of the Singapore Police Band. Encik Karim bin Ali, who played the cymbals on that day, recalls.
After years of singing God Save the Queen, singing in Majulah Singapura was the proudest moment. Being a Malay, the words has more meaning to me. I was determined to achieve for Singapore maju terus. In English, maju terus, it means we must look forward, but never look backward.
From that historic day onwards, there was a new song across the island. There was also the simple and striking flag of Singapore fluttering high all over the city. It's 29 years since the symbols of state were introduced to the public. Today, these symbols have become inextricably a part of our identity and destiny as the nation continues to strive for peace, progress, and prosperity.
December 8, 1965, soldiers lined St Andrews Road for the arrival of the head of state. It was the opening of Singapore's first parliament. It was only 2 years before that Singapore joined Malaysia, but the hopes and aspirations which had accompanied the island's entry into the Federation were short-lived. The attempt at merger had failed. The central government at Kuala Lumpur and the Singapore government had profound differences in their political beliefs. In the end, the only alternative, in order to avoid political and racial strife, was for Singapore to leave the Federation. And on the morning of December the 8th, PAP assemblymen and cabinet ministers made their way to Assembly House to map out a new future for an independent Singapore. Separation from Malaysia also meant that legislative assemblymen who were elected in the 1963 general elections had become Singapore's first members of parliament. Likewise, Assembly House came to be called Parliament House. Sharply at 10 a.m., the motorcade of the Yang di-Pertuan Negara arrived at the gates of Parliament House. At 54, Encik Yusof bin Ishak had been Singapore's first local-born head of state since the island was granted self-government in 1959. In the House, the fully occupied gallery and the seats taken up by PAP MPs stood out in sharp contrast with the silent and empty benches of the opposition. Members of the Barisan Sosialis had boycotted Parliament. Their chairman, Dr. Lee Siew Choh, had branded Singapore's independence as phony and had proclaimed that his party would not give legal cover to Parliament by being part of it. The Barisan Sosialis was then the sole opposition in Parliament. Their boycott was a fatal mistake, as it effectively excluded them from parliamentary politics, and this had led to a weakening of their party, as well as to the PAP's political dominance in Singapore. It was a one-party parliament, therefore, that greeted the Yang di-Pertuan Negara as he entered the House for his opening address.
Can take heart at the thought that there are a few new problems to bedevil this House. This House has gone through many a struggle, first against colonialism, then communism, and then communalism. And there have always been opportunists to cloud and confuse.
In his speech, Encik Yusof bin Ishak outlined the government's plans for the coming years and warned of the dangers that Singapore would face. It was a message with survival of the new state as the underlying theme. Touching on the dangers posed by communalism and communism, Encik Yusof reaffirmed the government's commitment to the building of a tolerant, multiracial state. Then as now, economic survival was a priority on the agenda. That meant trading with as many countries as possible, as Singapore could no longer rely on a common market with Malaysia, as had been envisaged during the period of merger. In areas of foreign policy and security, the Yang di-Pertuan Negara had this to say.
Our security depends upon having the minimum number of unfriendly countries and the maximum number of friendly ones. We want the least number of countries to be hostile to us, if for no reason other than we wish to be as independent of foreign defense assistance as possible. But now
in all, the President's speech reflected the desire to make an independent Singapore viable, and it was the responsibility of the First Parliament to undertake many of the goals outlined in that address.
In Africa and Eastern Europe.
Two important bills passed were the Constitutional Amendment Bill and the Independence of the Republic Bill. These saw to the constitutional transition of Singapore as a state within the Federation to that of an independent country. It also changed the title of the Yang di-Pertuan Negara to that of President of the Republic. Encik Yusof bin Ishak thus became Singapore's first president. Singapore's Minister for Defence, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, introduced the Army Bill, which was passed on the 24th of December 1965. The aim of this bill was to set up a well-trained regular army supported by a large people's volunteer force. Dr. Goh argued that Singaporeans should not be complacent about defence just because they were still under British military protection. No one could be sure, he said, when the British bases would be withdrawn from Singapore. The passing of the Army Bill saw the establishment of a People's Defence Force. Many MPs, like Mr. Jack Yun Tong, who was the Minister for Labour, and Encik Osman Wok, volunteered their services to set an example for their fellow citizens. The Army Bill was important because it prepared the people for the introduction of compulsory national service 2 years later in 1967.
There will be productive employment.
Our economy will probably do...
Many changes have taken place since the opening of the first Parliament.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I shall be very brief.
In 1984, for the first time in 23 years, 2 opposition members were voted into the House, and the parliamentary debates and proceedings were brought into the living rooms of Singaporeans a year later in 1985. To a large extent, the steps taken by successive parliaments since the first sitting in 1965 has contributed significantly to the evolution of Singapore into a modern and thriving city-state with a standard of living that is the highest in the region. And this progress, in many ways, echoes the President's closing words to the first Parliament. An industrious and talented people striving to secure their future will surge forward to prosperity and strength if they are given honest administration and effective leadership. Bertha Maria Hertog, born in Java in 1937 to Dutch Catholic parents. 13 years later, she was to become embroiled in one of the most violent episodes in Singapore's history. The story begins in Java in 1942. The Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies and took thousands of prisoners. One of the many Dutch soldiers captured was Sergeant Adrianus Hertog. He left behind 5 children, one of them 5-year-old Maria. With her father a prisoner of war, Maria came under the care of Amina bint Muhammad, an old family friend who took her home to Bandung. Amina claims that Maria was given to her for adoption, but according to Mrs. Hertog, Maria was only meant to be in Amina's care for 3 or 4 days. When Maria did not return, Mrs. Hertog went to Bandung to bring her daughter home, but on the way, she was interned by the Japanese. Maria stayed with Amina in Indonesia for 5 years. In 1947, during the Indonesian War of Independence, they went to Malaya. During this time, Maria was brought up as a Muslim and given the name Nadra. She spoke only Malay. In 1945, the Hertogs were reunited and began a search for their daughter. They returned to Holland, where in 1949 they received news that Maria was in Malaya. They asked the Dutch Consul General in Singapore to help them find their daughter. In April 1950, Amina and Maria came to Singapore to negotiate with the authorities. Amina did not want to part with Maria. On the 22nd of April 1950, the Chief Justice granted the Consul General's application for Maria to be placed in the temporary custody of the Social Welfare Department. This was to prevent Amina from taking Maria out of Singapore. Maria and Amina had not been informed of the court proceedings and were not represented. Two days later, Maria was admitted into the Girls' Homecraft Center at York Hill.
She's a very nice girl, you can talk to her and she will listen, and she will also, try to do her best according to how she felt. But I felt sorry for her at that time because, not because of any fault of hers, she had to be, put in among strangers. Not her own nationality and not her own the religion she's been brought up with.
On the 19th of May, the Chief Justice ruled that Maria had to be returned to her natural parents after a 15-minute hearing. Maria refused to be parted from Amina. She clung to her, crying, "Amina is my mother." A few days later, Amina sought legal advice and lodged an appeal. On the 28th of July, the appeal court returned Maria to Amina. 4 days later, Maria, now 13, was married under Muslim rites to Mansour Adabi, a 22-year-old teacher. But the Hertogs were intent on getting Maria back. On the 13th of November, Mrs. Hertog arrived in Singapore for yet another court hearing. Maria reluctantly met her mother 2 days later. She told her mother that she was a Muslim and had chosen to stay with her husband. On the 21st of November, the hearing began. Mr. Schön, lawyer for the Hertogs, claimed that Maria's marriage was a maneuver to prejudice further court proceedings. He also said Maria was not given to Amina, but that Amina had taken her away from the Hertogs. By now, the case had attracted much publicity. On the last day of the hearing, 1,000 people waited outside the High Court to catch a glimpse of Maria. The judge awarded custody of Maria to her Dutch father on the grounds that Mr. Hertog had been a prisoner of war in 1942 and had not been consulted when Maria was given away. The judge also ruled that Maria should be governed by Dutch law. He invalidated Maria's marriage because under Dutch law, marriage for minors under 16 was not allowed. This upset the Muslim community who saw Maria's Muslim marriage as inviolate. The court did not recognize Maria as a Muslim. In the eyes of the law, she was still a child. Her father, who was responsible for her, was a Christian and would never have consented to her becoming a Muslim. This also angered the Muslims. But Maria did not want to return to her Dutch parents. She wanted to stay in Singapore with her husband and Amina. However, she was taken to the convent of the Good Shepherd in Thompson Road, where she was allowed to see only her mother. Newspaper articles of Maria in the convent appeared almost daily in the press.
One picture in particular of Maria seen weeping in the convent and being comforted by Christian nuns was also enough to cause people's feelings to be roused, particularly since she had been betrothed to a Muslim. And so, in fact, as the newspapers pointed out, for a Muslim girl to be taken into the protection of a Christian convent was a very, very wrong decision on the part of the colonial authorities.
On the 9th of December, a Nadra Action Committee was set up to gather Muslim support for Maria's case. Among its members was Karim Ghani, a Tamil Muslim from India who was also manager of the Muslim publishing house. Karim Ghani, through his newspapers, whipped up religious feelings among the Muslims. In one issue of Dawn, a weekly newspaper, Ghani was reported to have told a large crowd at the Sultan Mosque that they would have to enter into a holy war as a last resort. On the 11th of December, Amina appealed yet again for custody of Maria. A large crowd gathered outside the High Court. The appeal was dismissed after only 5 minutes. To the Muslims outside, this confirmed their impression that the courts were biased towards the Dutch couple. After the verdict, the angry crowd rioted. Fighting began on the Padang, but soon spread all over the island. The European community lived in fear of attacks by the angry Muslims who set upon the Europeans and Eurasians they saw on the streets. Some were even dragged out of their cars and beaten.
To my astonishment, I saw cars being turned on their sides and windows being broken, and a great mob of people armed with parangs and poles and other implements beating up people, setting fire to vehicles, and well, my journalistic instincts were certainly heightened, and I thought to myself, well, this looks like a good news story. As I stepped forward, well, the mob charged at me, and I ran. Some of my colleagues, of course, weren't so fortunate as me, and the head of the Associated Press Bureau in Singapore, a man named Tom Masterson, was very badly beaten up and later died from his injuries.
We came up behind a traction company bus that had stopped, and I noticed an elderly person being pushed down from the bus, and he fell into the drain, and he was set upon by some people with sticks and fists, and he was beaten up.
That old man was amongst the 9 killed by the mob. 173 others were injured. Troops had to be called in to control the crowd. 9 rioters were shot by the police and army, bringing the death toll to 18. A 24-hour curfew was imposed to control the violence. The riots went on for 3 days, but the curfew lasted 2 weeks. In the following year, a commission of inquiry set up to identify the reasons for the Maria Hertog riots ascribed the first disorders outside the Supreme Court to religious passions whipped up over Maria's case. It found that later outbreaks were racial in nature, directed indiscriminately against Europeans and Eurasians. Another major factor was the publicity given to Maria when she was in the convent. The continued publicity fanned the growing anger amongst local Muslims that they had been treated unfairly. The commission said they considered it regrettable that journalists and photographers were allowed to enter the convent. It also said the decision to put Maria in a convent was tragically ill-advised. It sparked the fuse which led to the riots. The government should have removed Maria to a more neutral environment when it realized that the Muslims were unhappy about Maria in a convent. A third reason for the riot was that many of the police rank and file were Malays. The commission found many instances of deliberate inaction by them. Another reason not stated by the commission report was the colonial government's mishandling of the situation, as pointed out by the British press. The Manchester Guardian stated that the government's inability to prevent the riots has been matched by its incompetence in policing them. It could not understand how Maria, a Muslim, came to be placed in a Christian convent. It said that this was a challenge to Islam of the kind which a wise government avoids. The day after the riots started, Maria was sent to Holland by plane. She became a Christian, remarried, and had 13 children. But her personal tragedy was not over. Her marriage began to break up. She saw a documentary about her childhood and the riots which had taken her name. She became disturbed. In 1976, she was put on trial for conspiring to murder her husband. For Maria, it was a childhood tragedy which haunted her for the rest of her life. But that tragedy has become a legacy for a nation, a solemn lesson in racial and religious harmony not to be forgotten.